On the morning of 14th of August 2005, something mysterious and frightening appeared in the skies above Athens, the capital of Greece. Around 10,000 meters up in the air, a passenger plane was silently circling, not talking to anyone, like a ghost in the clouds. The terrifying part was that for the last 2 hours the aircraft had completely ignored every single message from the control towers. Fear quickly spread through Athens. Was this a terrorist plan? A hijacking? Or something even worse? Because of the danger, the Greek Air Force immediately launched its fighter jets to check what was happening. As the jets flew closer, the pilots were shocked at what they saw. Inside the plane there was silence, so deep it felt unreal. Passengers were sitting in their seats, lifeless, motionless, as if time itself had frozen. Even the cockpit appeared empty. But then the fighter pilot spotted one person inside. Strangely, he did not look like a pilot at all. He was wandering around, moving as if confused, as if searching for something or trying desperately to figure something out. Suddenly, the aircraft tilted sharply to one side and began to descend rapidly, heading down toward the earth like a falling giant. Just minutes later, the plane crashed into the mountains north of Athens. In that horrific moment, all 121 passengers and crew members on board lost their lives. But how could this have happened? Why was there no sound, no movement inside? Why did the pilots and crew never respond to a single call after takeoff? What strange series of events turned this routine flight into such a nightmare? This was the story of Helios Flight 522, later remembered with a spine-chilling name, the Ghost Plane. Dear viewers, welcome once again to the video. Our story begins on the morning of 14th August 2005 at Larnaca Airport in Cyprus. On board Helios Flight 522 were 115 passengers and 6 crew members. Their ultimate destination was the beautiful city of Prague in the Czech Republic, but along the way they had one planned stopover in Athens. It was summertime, holiday season, and most of the passengers were happy vacationers traveling to enjoy their trip, many of whom were going to step off in Athens. The captain of this flight was an extremely experienced man, 59 years old, with more than 17,000 flight hours in the skies. His first officer, also highly trained, was 51 years old and had already spent 7,500 hours in the air. Usually, in aviation disasters, people often talk about the crew's abilities and decision-making. But in this case, the twists of the story were very different. These two pilots had flown together before, and the first officer often complained to friends and family about the captain's harsh and pressuring attitude. Even the airline management already knew about this issue. Not only that, the first officer also had training records which showed that he sometimes struggled with handling checklist procedures properly. This detail might sound small, but later it would become one of the most crucial points of the entire tragedy. The aircraft was a 7-year-old Boeing 737-300. On that cool summer morning, the plane took off smoothly from Larnaca Airport. After climbing through the early bright sky, the crew contacted Nicosia Air Traffic Control, the nearest tower in Cyprus, and asked permission to fly at 34,000 feet. Permission was granted. But then, something strange began to happen. As the aircraft crossed 12,000 feet altitude, a loud warning alarm suddenly echoed inside the cockpit. The sound was very familiar. It was the exact alarm that usually went off on the ground if there was a problem with the takeoff configuration before the plane even leaves the runway. But here it was, ringing in mid-air, where it clearly wasn't supposed to be. Shocked and confused, the captain quickly contacted the airline's operations center. He explained about the strange warning, calling it a takeoff configuration alarm, and also reported that the lights showing ventilation cooling fans were switched off. He then asked the ground engineer where exactly the circuit breakers for those fans were located. The engineer, sitting safely on the ground, replied calmly that those fan lights should indeed be off during flight anyway, and the circuit breakers were behind the captain's seat. When the engineer told him to double-check the situation, the captain answered in a confusing way, saying it was not off. His reply made no sense to the engineer. At that moment, the engineer suddenly remembered something important. Just before the flight, He himself had inspected the plane's pressurization system, and those controls were dangerously close to the switches the captain was confused about. So, the engineer suspiciously asked, "Captain, is the pressurization switch set to auto or manual?" But instead of answering the question, the captain repeated his earlier query about the circuit breakers. Meanwhile, during this confusing conversation, oxygen masks had already dropped in the passenger cabin. Within moments, contact between Helios Flight 522 and ground operations disappeared completely. The aircraft soon reached a height of 34,000 feet, gliding smoothly as if nothing was wrong. But all attempts to contact it were still failing miserably. Helios operations, growing more and more alarmed, reached out to Nicosia Air Traffic Control, asking them to try making contact with Flight 522. For the next 5 minutes, the controllers repeatedly called the aircraft, their voices filling the airwaves. But every attempt was met with eerie silence. Not ready to give up, the controller then contacted another plane flying nearby and requested that its pilots try reaching Flight 522 directly. Once again, this attempt failed, and the radio remained cold and lifeless. Meanwhile, Flight 522 had silently crossed into Greek airspace without permission, continuing to follow its flight plan as though guided by a ghostly hand. Even the emergency frequency, meant to guarantee communication in critical situations, was tried again and again, but the result remained the same. No reply, no sign of life. Nicosia ATC then called Athens Control, urgently asking whether they had managed to establish contact. Unfortunately, Athens also tried calling, and once again there was no answer. At this point, there were two chilling possibilities. Either the aircraft had experienced a major radio transmission malfunction, which meant the crew could hear the calls but were somehow unable to respond, or, the darker thought, that the pilots had been taken hostage inside their own cockpit. Considering the first possibility, Athens Control cleared the plane to descend, just in case the crew was listening. Yet Flight 522 showed no movement, no sign that anyone was following instructions. After more than 20 attempts and still absolute silence, Athens ATC had no choice but to escalate. They informed the Greek Air Force that Flight 522 had entered their airspace without clearance, flying blindly and ignoring all messages. Greece responded immediately, scrambling 2 F-16 fighter jets to intercept the mysterious airliner. By this time, the autopilot of Flight 522 was calmly and perfectly guiding the aircraft along its original path. Astonishingly, the descent point where the pilots were supposed to bring the plane down had already been missed. Twice. Yet the jet carried on, level at 34,000 feet. Like a machine on rails, at 7:37 a.m., Flight 522 began circling above Athens Airport, entering what pilots call a holding pattern. This maneuver allows a plane to circle around the airport in loops until it receives clearance to land. Round and round it went, as if waiting for an order it would never obey. By the 6th loop, 2 thunderous F-16 jets had caught up with it. The time was now 8:30 in the morning. The lead F-16 pilot radioed in a report that sent shivers down everyone's spine. He said, astonished, that the captain's seat inside the cockpit was completely empty. He then glanced into the passenger cabin. On the far side of the windows, faintly lit by sunlight, he could make out the silent passengers. Each one sat motionless in their seat, oxygen masks dangling over their faces like pale reminders of survival. Not a single person moved. As the aircraft turned for its 10th loop above Athens, the fighter pilot suddenly noticed something. A man, dressed in a light blue shirt and a black vest, walked into the cockpit. Calmly, he sat down in the captain's seat. He placed headphones over his ears and set his hands on the cockpit panel in front of him, like someone truly trying to take control in a desperate storm. When the F-16 pilot signaled him with a wave, the man inside raised his hand and waved back, showing he was still conscious. But the tiny glimpse of hope faded quickly. Within moments, the left engine of the airliner sputtered and failed. The plane lurched heavily to the left, tilting as it began its deadly descent. Just before 9 a.m., the right engine also shut down, one last gasp before silence. With no power left, the mighty aircraft drifted down like a lifeless bird. 4 minutes later, it slammed into the mountains northwest of Athens and was destroyed entirely. Investigators were immediately called to the scene. They examined the scattered wreckage, and soon interviews began with the engineer who had worked on the aircraft the night before. What came to light was shocking yet precise. Just one night earlier, this very engineer had been performing a pressurization leak test on the aircraft. During this procedure, he had switched the pressurization system from auto mode to manual mode. But, fatally, after completing his test, he forgot to return the switch back to auto. This mistake meant that when the plane climbed to 34,000 feet, the cabin was no longer maintaining proper air pressure. Bit by bit, oxygen levels inside dropped dangerously. In such low-pressure conditions, the human brain can only function for about 10 minutes. After that, confusion sets in, memory slips, judgment fails, and then comes loss of consciousness and death. This condition is called hypoxia, a silent, deadly starvation of the brain. The pilots should have checked that pressurization switch as part of their pre-flight duties. Had they noticed it still set to manual, this whole disaster could have been avoided. But tragically, they did not. Because normally the switch was always left in auto mode, their routine checks did not catch the mistake. They still had 2 more chances, once during taxiing and once more just after takeoff. But both opportunities were missed. By the time the aircraft passed 12,000 feet, the cabin altitude warning alarm sounded. Had they recognized it as a pressurization alert, they may have fixed the error. But instead, they misunderstood it, believing it to be a takeoff configuration alarm. Following the wrong checklist procedures, they wasted precious time on a mistake that did not exist, ignoring the true danger silently stealing the oxygen from their bodies. Moments later, oxygen masks deployed from the ceiling and warning lights flashed. Yet by then, hypoxia was already influencing the judgment of the crew. They failed to notice what was right before their eyes. One by one, the captain and first officer began to lose consciousness. About 10 minutes later, even the passengers and most of the cabin crew succumbed, their oxygen masks only delaying the inevitable. But then, who was the mysterious man that the fighter pilot saw entering the cockpit 2 hours later? Investigations revealed his identity. He was Andreas Prodromou, one of the flight attendants. Unlike most cabin crew, he also held a commercial pilot's license, although he was not qualified specifically to fly a Boeing 737. When investigators checked the cockpit voice recorder, they heard evidence that Prodromou had desperately tried to make mayday calls after the engines began failing. But tragically, in his confusion, he forgot to press the transmission button, and his final cries for help went unheard. His skills, while impressive, were not enough to guide a heavy airliner. And even if by some miracle he could have landed the plane, the passengers and crew, having suffered so long without oxygen, would not have survived anyway. By this time, the brain damage caused by hypoxia was irreversible. Among the wreckage, investigators found 3 of the 4 portable oxygen cylinders in used condition. This proved that Prodromou, and probably 2 other cabin crew members, had used them, allowing them to stay conscious longer than everyone else. They fought with all their strength trying to save lives, but the odds were impossible. The tragedy of Helios Flight 522 shocked the world and changed aviation forever. Afterward, new safety measures and standard operating procedures were introduced. Boeing was specifically instructed to improve pilot training on differentiating between warning alarms, so that mistakes like this would never again claim so many lives. Since then, the skies have not seen another disaster quite like this one. And with that, dear viewers, we close this harrowing tale. Helios Flight 522, the so-called ghost plane, left behind unforgettable lessons in aviation safety. Thank you for all your love, your likes, and your wonderful comments. Until we meet again in another incredible story, stay safe, stay curious, and keep flying high with us.